Chapter 14 Flareups of Antiforeignism. The invasion by the so-called immigrant rabble in the 1840s and 1850s inflamed the prejudices of American nativists. They feared that these foreign hordes would outbreed, outvote, and overwhelm the old native stock. Not only did the newcomers take jobs from the Native Americans, but the bulk of the displaced Irish were Roman Catholics, as were a substantial minority of the Germans. The Church of Rome was still widely regarded by many old line Americans as a foreign church. Convents were commonly referred to as popish brothels. What you understand about here, looking at that paragraph, is of course that there was not necessarily that much acceptance of the new immigrants coming in, especially because they were Catholic. Roman Catholics were now on the move, seeking to protect their children from Protestant indoctrination in the public schools. They began in the 1840s to construct an entirely separate Catholic educational system, an enormously expensive undertaking for a poor immigrant community, but one that revealed the strength of its religious commitment. They had formed a negligible minority during the colonial days, and their numbers had increased gradually. With the enormous influx of the Irish and the Germans in the 1840s and 1850s, the Catholics became a powerful religious group. In 1840, they had ranked fifth behind Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists. By 1850, with some 1.8 million communicants, they had bounded into first place, a position they never lost. What you understand about that paragraph, it's basically discussing just the rise of Catholicism. It became the most prominent religion by the 1850s. One of the things that they did do was to just go ahead and create a Catholic church or Catholic school in order to protect themselves from Protestant children. Crooked voting. A bitter nativist cartoon charging Irish and German immigrants with stealing elections. So what you could see here in this cartoon is, of course, a threat by a lot of nativists, and nativists referred to people that were already in America prior to this time frame. What they were concerned of is the new Irish immigrants and German immigrants who were here perceived as, I guess you could say, alcohol-loving immigrants. What they were afraid of, there was somebody moving in that they would go ahead and outvote the other, just the nativists. Older stock Americans were alarmed by these mounting figures. They professed to believe that in due time, the alien riffraff would establish a Catholic Church at the expense of Protestantism and would introduce popish idols. The noisier American nativists rallied for political action. In 1849, they formed the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, which soon developed into a formidable American party, commonly known as the Know Nothing Party, a name derived from its secretiveness. Nativists agitated the rigid restrictions on immigration and naturalization and for laws authorizing the deportation of alien paupers. They also promoted a lurid literature of exposure, much more of it pure fiction. The authors, sometimes posed as escaped nuns, described the shocking sins they imagined cloisters concealed, including the secret burial of babies. One of these sensational books was Maria Monk's Awful Disclosure in 1836. It sold over 300,000 copies. Even uglier was occasional mass violence. As early as 1834, a Catholic convent near Boston was burned down by a howling mob. In ensuing years, few scattered attacks fell upon Catholic schools and churches. The most insightful flare-up occurred during 1844 in Philadelphia, where the Irish Catholics fought back against the threats of nativists. The city of brotherly love did not quiet down until 2 Catholic churches had been burned down and some 13 citizens had been killed and 50 wounded in several days of fighting. These outbursts of tolerance, though infrequent and generally localized in larger cities, remain an unfortunate blot on the record of America's treatment of minority groups. So one of the things that you could see here in that paragraph I read prior to this is you are starting to get Protestants to politically form to ensure that the Catholics do not get the majority vote. So you're getting organizations such as the Order of Star-Spangled Banner, as well as the Know Nothing Party. You're getting books that are released to kind of criticize the mass amounts of immigration during this time. And of course, in the paragraph I just read, you're starting to see mass amounts of violence. And what I mean by mass, and now let me take that back, not mass, but you're starting to see violence between the nativists and new immigrant groups, and you'll see these specifically in larger cities. Immigrants were undeniably making America a more pluralistic society, one of the most ethically and racially varied in the history of the world. And perhaps it was a small wonder that cultural clashes would occur. Why, in fact, were such episodes not even more frequent and more violent? Part of the answer lies in the robustness of the American economy. The vigorous growth of the economy in these years both attracted immigrants in the first place and ensured that once they arrived, they would claim the share of American wealth without jeopardizing the wealth of others. Their hands and brains, in fact, helped fuel economic expansion. Immigrants in the American economy, in short, needed one another. Without the newcomers, a preponderantly agricultural United States might have well condemned to watch and envy as industrial revolution swept through 19th century Europe. So we look at that paragraph, of course, with the immigrants coming in, this helped fuel the industrial revolution, right? So it was really beneficial for the American economy. Contending voices, immigration, pro and con. Strong anti-foreignism was reflected in the platform of the American Know-Nothing Party in 1856. Americans must rule America, and to end native-born citizens should be selected for all state, federal, or municipal offices of government employment in preference to naturalized citizens. Yet both transcendentalists and eventual converts to Roman Catholicism, or S. Bronson, wrote of Boston Irish immigrant ghetto in 1852. Out from these dirty streets will come from some of the noblest sons of our country, whom we shall delight to own and honor. How have these kinds of attitudes towards immigrants affected American society over the last 2 centuries? So you're seeing here just two different views. You're seeing, of course, the anti-foreignism view reflected by the Know Nothing Party here, right? And then, of course, here you're showing hope that these new immigrants, of course, are going to be the noblest of the country. So it's praising them. So let's go ahead and look at our Chapter 14 questions. Flare-ups, define nativism. One thing you want to understand about nativism. Nativism is, of course, just pride within the Americans that already exist within this time. The Americans that took pride in their own culture and were opposed to that of immigrants. Why was a Know Nothing or American Party formed, and what laws did the party want? They wanted more restriction in terms of immigration, and the Know Nothing Party specifically formed because they didn't want to be outvoted by the German, the Irish immigrants coming in. What role did immigrants play in the Industrial Revolution? One of the things that they did that was so important was, of course, that they helped fuel the Industrial Revolution. They were the workers, right? So with that in mind, that prevented some of the mass amounts of violence that could have taken place. Creeping mechanization. That's the next portion or next chapter. (14.7) Creeping mechanization. A group of gifted British inventors beginning in about 1750 perfected a series of machines for the mass production of textiles. This harnessing of steam multiplied the power of human muscles some 10,000-fold and ushered in the modern factory system, and with it, the so-called Industrial Revolution. It was accompanied by no less spectacular transformation in agricultural production and the methods of transportation and communication. The factory system gradually spread from Britain, the world's workshop, to other lands. It took a generation or so to reach Western Europe and then the United States. Why was a youthful American republic eventually to become an industrial giant, so slow to embrace the machine? For one thing, land was cheap in America. Land-starved descendants of land-starved peasants were not going to coop themselves up in smelly factories when they might till their own acres in God's fresh air and sunlight. Labor was therefore generally scarce, and enough nimble hands to operate the machines were hard to find, until immigrants began to pour ashore in the 1840s. Money for capital investment, moreover, was not plentiful in the pioneering America, whose industrial revolution, like that many of a developing country in later centuries, awaited an influx of foreign capital, which in turn awaited the assurance of secure property rights, sufficient infrastructure, an adequate workforce, and the political stability. Without such capital, raw materials lay underdeveloped, underdiscovered, or unsuspected. The Republic was one day to become the world's leading coal producer. Much of the coal burned in the colonial times was imported all the way from Britain. The young country also had difficulty producing goods of high enough quality and cheap enough costs to compete with the mass-produced European products. Long-established British factories, in particular, provided cutthroat competition. Their superiority was attested by the fact that a few unscrupulous Yankee manufacturers, out to make a dishonest dollar, stamped their own products with fake English trademarks. So a couple things you want to understand here was, of course, with this first paragraph here, this idea of machine and mass production of textiles, of course, is coming from Great Britain through the results of steam power, which is making work a lot more efficient. Um, One of the things that you want to understand here is the reason why American industrialization didn't necessarily happen, or why it happened later than that in Europe, was number one, you're looking at they didn't have the amount of workers, right? They didn't have enough workers to really kind of spark the Industrial Revolution until the mass amount of immigrants were coming in. Okay. And of course, just quality of goods. I mean, just trying to compete with Great Britain was one of the challenges that they had during this time. The British enjoyed monopoly of the textile machinery, whose secrets they were anxious to hide from foreign competitors. Parliament enacted laws in harmony with the mercantile system, forbidding the export of machines or the emigration machines able to reproduce them. Although a number of small manufacturer enterprises existed in the early republic, the future industrious colossus was still snoring. Not until the middle of the 19th century did the output of the factories exceed that of the farms. So one thing you understand is Great Britain is really trying to do its best to ensure that the Industrial Revolution was not leaving Great Britain. So one of the things that we're looking here is with creeping mechanization. You should have been able to answer these. Um, well, four reasons the Industrial Revolution. Why was it slow to develop? We definitely hit that one. We're going to go over Eli Whitney, right? And of course, cotton gin and the slavery in a second. 14.8. Whitney ends the fiber famine. Samuel Slater has been acclaimed as the father of the factory system in America, and seldom can a paternity of the movement more properly be ascribed to one person. A skilled British mechanic of 21, he was attracted by the bounties being offered to British workers familiar with the textile machines. After memorizing the plans for the machinery, he escaped in disguise to America, where he won the backing of Moses Brown, a Quaker capitalist in Rhode Island. Laboriously reconstructing the essential apparatus with the aid of a blacksmith and carpenter, he put into operation in 1791 the first efficient American machinery for spinning cotton thread. The ravenous mechanism was now ready, but where was the cotton fiber? Handpicking 1 pound of lint from 3 pounds of seed was a full day's work for one slave, but this process was so expensive that the American made cotton cloth was relatively rare. So Samuel Slater, he's a person that you need to know because what he's doing is he's bringing the idea of the factory system from Great Britain over to America. However, as stated in the next paragraph or the previous paragraph, one of the issues that we're having is this factory system is evident, but just to go ahead and pick cotton was something that was very time consuming. Another mechanical genius, Massachusetts-born Eli Whitney, now made his mark. After graduating from Yale, he journeyed to Georgia to serve as a private tutor while preparing for the law. There, he was told the poverty of the South would be revealed if someone could only invent a workable device for separating the seed for the short staple cotton fiber. Within 10 days in 1793, he built a crude machine called a cotton gin, short for engine, that was 50 times more effective than the hand-picking process. Few machines have ever wrought such a wondrous a change. The gin affected not only the history of America, but that of the world. Almost overnight, the raising of cotton became highly profitable, and the South was tied hand on foot to the throne of the King Cotton. Human bondage had been dying out, but the insatiable demand for cotton re-riveted the chains and limbs of the downtrodden Southern blacks. So obviously, the cotton gin is something that's going to go ahead and change the South, but as well as the world, because it went ahead and made just cotton picking way more efficient. Francis Cabot Lowell's mill, Waltham, Massachusetts, 1826. Cotton industry, carding, drawing, and roving, engraving, 1835. Built in 1814, Lowell's mill left was a marvelous manufacturing efficiency. It combined all phases of production, including spinning and weaving, under one roof. The mill's labor force, was composed primarily of young women from local farming communities. South and North both prospered. Slave-driving planters cleared more acres for cotton, pushing the cotton kingdom westward off the depleted tidewater plains over Piedmont and onto the black loam bottomlands of Alabama and Mississippi. Humming gins poured out avalanches of snowy fiber from the spindles of Yankee machines. Though the decades to come, the mills, Britain brought the lion's share of southern cotton. The American phase of the Industrial Revolution, which first blossomed in cotton textiles, was well on its way. Factories at first flourished most actively in New England, though they had branched out into the more populous areas of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. The South increasingly wedded the production of cotton, could boast of comparatively little manufacturing. Its capital was bound in slaves. Its local consumers, for the most part, were desperately poor. New England was singularly favored as industrial center for several reasons. Its narrow belt of stony soil made farming difficult and hence made manufacturing attractive. A relatively dense population provided labor and accessible markets. Shipping brought in capital, and snug seaports made easy the import of raw materials and export of finished products. Finally, the rapid rivers, notably the Merrimack and Massachusetts, provided abundant water to turn the cogs of machines. By 1860, more than 400 million pounds of southern cotton poured annually into the gaping maws, over 1,000 mills, mostly in New England. So, a couple things that you want to make sure you understand here was that South and North were both prospering as a result of the cotton gin. Slave driving planters cleared more acres for cotton, pushing the cotton kingdom westward. So you're starting to see, of course, the spread of these plantations, and that's the role of slaves during this time, is just to ensure that they're spreading this land westward. However, industrialization is happening in the North instead of the South for several reasons. A lot of this could be just because of the quality of land, right? The quality of the land isn't as good as in the North, so therefore factories would probably just make more sense to create them there because you can't farm, right? You'd want to use more of that farming in other areas. Another reason why is also just because of shipping, right? With the North, there's a lot of rivers that makes it very attractive to being able to just trade with the markets. So that's why one of the reasons why manufacturing is happening in the North and not the South. Yeah, and of course, we're kind of seeing here why did North industrialize to such a degree? Well, I kind of just went over that. How did cotton gin allow American slavery to survive? Well, of course, you're seeing uh, just the frequency, right? That they're able to go ahead and take cotton more efficiently, kind of going off 22, but as well as slaves, what they're doing is clearing the land to kind of create more cotton plantations because it was in such high demand. Okay. 14.9 Marvels in Manufacturing. America's factories spread slowly until about 1807, where there began the fateful sequence of the embargo, non intercourse, and the War of 1812. Stern necessity dictated the manufacture of substitutes for normal imports. With the stoppage of European commerce was temporarily ruinous to Yankee shipping, both capital and labor were driven from the waves onto the factory floor. As New England, in the striking phrase of John Randolph, exchanged a trident for the distaff. Generous bounties were offered by local authorities for homegrown goods. Buy American and Wear American became popular slogans, and patriotism promoted the wearing of baggy homespun garments. President Madison donned some at his inauguration, where he said he had been walking argument for the processing of native wool. So this paragraph is basically saying is there's a push, of course, as we've seen through some of the economic policies in period 4, to buy American goods. But the manufacturing boomlet broke abruptly with the Peace of Ghent in 1815. British competitors unloaded their dammed up surpluses at ruinously low prices, and American newspapers are so full of British advertisements for goods on credit that there was little space left for news. In one Rhode Island district, all 150 mills were forced to close their doors, except the original Slater plant, responding to pained outcries. Congress provided some relief when it passed a mildly protective tariff of 1816, among the earliest political contests to control and shape the economy. So, of course, British goods were by far dominating American goods at this time. That's why you're going to go ahead and have some of these tariffs that are being passed. As the factory system flourished, it embraced numerous other industries in addition to textiles. Prominent among them was the manufacturing of firearms. And here, the wizardly Eli Whitney, again appeared with an extraordinary contribution. Frustrated in his earlier efforts to monopolize the cotton gin, he turned to the mass production of the muskets for the U.S. Army. Up to this time, each part of the firearm had been hand tooled, and if one trigger broke, the trigger of another might or might not fit. About 1798, Whitney seized upon the idea of having machines make each part, so that all triggers, for example, would be as much alike as successive imprints of copperplate engraving. Journeying to Washington, he reportedly dismantled 10 of his new muskets in the presence of skeptical officials, scrambled the parts together, and quickly reassembled 10 different muskets. So what this is called is interchangeable parts. All right. The principle of interchangeable parts was widely adopted by 1850. It gave to a host of other innovations, including Samuel Colt's fabled revolver, and it so ultimately became the basis of modern mass production. It assembly line methods that set the northern states on path to the thoroughgoing industrialization. Ironically, the same Yankee Eli Whitney, by performing the cotton gin, had also given slavery a renewed lease on life, making the Civil War more likely. Yet, by nourishing the North's Industrial Revolution, Whitney conferred upon a massive advantage when that showdown finally became. So, a couple of things that we want to understand here, of course, through the just through the musket, what Eli was able to do, or Eli Whitney was able to do, of course, is to come up with this idea of interchangeable parts. And this, he kind of explained this. The principle of interchangeable parts was widely adopted by 1850. It gave rise to a host of other innovations, such as the Colt, right? So instead of breaking down and buying a whole new musket in general, or a gun, right, or a revolver, what you could do is go ahead and replace parts for it, right? That was a whole new concept, and of course, Eli Whitney is responsible for that. The sewing machine, invented by Elias Howe in 1846 and perfected by Isaac Singer, gave another strong boost to northern industrialization. The sewing machine became the foundation of the ready-made clothing industry, which took root at about the same time of the Civil War. It drove many a seamstress from the shelter of the private home to the factory, where, like a human robot, she tended to clattering mechanisms. Each momentous new invention seemed to stimulate still more imaginative inventions. For a decade ending in 1800, only 306 patents were registered in Washington, but the decade ending in 1860 saw the amazing total of 28,000. Yet in 1838, the clerk of the patent office resigned in despair, complaining that all worthwhile inventions had been discovered. So a couple things you want to understand here, of course. With these innovations, most of these are happening in the North, which when the Civil War does happen, this gives the North kind of some of these advantages. Um, a couple people you want to know, of course, Eli Howe with the sewing machine and Isaac Singer with the was the one that perfects it. Uh, this obviously makes the clothing industry develop a little bit more, and by 1860, we're getting more than 28,000 innovations and inventions in the patent office. So what the patent office basically means is, of course, that someone is getting credit for that invention, and it cannot be duplicated where someone could take credit for it later on. The growth in cotton production and consumption. Whitney's gin left made possibly the mass cultivation of upland or short stable cotton, which was unprofitable to raise when it seeds, had to be laboriously removed by hand. As cotton production pushed farther south and west, taking slavery with it, it provisioned a growing northern textile industry. Calico or patent cotton cloth was hand produced by wood blocking, printing with colored dyes, as shown here at the right. The availability of plentiful, cheap cloth vastly expanded women's wardrobes. So, a couple things, of course, with as a result of the cotton gin, there was a higher demand for land, right? So people were moving westward in order to expand these cotton plantations, which still made slavery very much more prominent. But with this in mind, of course, you're also going to get rising sectionalism. So if we go ahead, a couple things that we should have been able to, you should have definitely been able to answer 26 to 27. We're going to go through 28 through 30 next.